Energy Media readers, we are going to be doing another installment on the Wet'suwet'en controversy around the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And today we're going to be talking to Shawn McCarthy, veteran energy journalist Shawn McCarthy in Ottawa. Welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Hello, Markham.
So let me frame the question this way. My sources are telling me that the Wet'suwet'en had been trying to engage Ottawa and British Columbia around the issue of the pipeline, their objections. They didn't want it over their traditional territories, and they weren't getting much attention. And even though they had the Unistoten camp up and were denying access to the company, but then all of a sudden, the other First Nations, like the Mohawks in Ontario, began blockades in solidarity with them. And suddenly Eastern Canadian consumers and commuters and so on are inconvenienced, and boom, they're on the national agenda, and they have the Prime Minister's attention, and suddenly everybody's involved in this. And that seems to me to be a bit of a new strategy if they continue coordinating like this. What's your take on that?
Well, it's an effective strategy, first of all. I mean, you know, they weren't getting very far. There had been a process. There was a court injunction against them. The federal government was saying this is a BC situation in the sense that it was a provincial review of the project, and the RCMP in BC acts as a provincial police force. So the federal government wanted no part of it, clearly, as much as they could stay away. You know, they weren't getting anywhere, certainly not with the federal government. More pressure locally in BC. But if you want to get the attention of people, you have to apply pressure and you have to find leverage. And so the Mohawks of Tyendinaga are creating that leverage for the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs. And you know, it's a good strategy on their part, for sure.
It's very interesting. There was a press conference today by the Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa. Had National Chief Perry Bellegarde, and there were a few other chiefs there. And I was struck by the tenor, the tone of the comments. While they were assertive, they talked over and over again about how we want engagement, we want this to be done peacefully, we don't want to be doing these kinds of things. We need the governments to come to the table in nation-to-nation discussions, and we need to do it soon. And as opposed to the saber rattling one hears out of Alberta and Premier Jason Kenney and so on, I was struck by the contrast between those two. And what do you make of that?
Well, the AFN has a challenge. I mean, let's remember who the AFN is, first of all. It represents elected chiefs across the country. And it was the elected chiefs in Wet'suwet'en who voted in favor or reached an agreement with Coastal GasLink, a benefits agreement. So, you know, there are divisions within the First Nations world and the Indigenous world on these issues, and nobody should expect it to be monolithic. I think the AFN tries to stick to first principles, which is, you know, recognition of title, and where there's no title, of traditional rights, and you know, sticking very close to court opinion and that sort of thing. So, you know, they will try to maintain a dialogue. There was dialogue, though. I mean, this was a long process where each of the First Nations in British Columbia was dealt with individually and separately by the company, and then by the provincial review panel, and so on. So, you know, that happened. But when you get to impasse, then it's still the federal government that has responsibility, that represents the Crown, and has responsibility to be involved. And so, you know, this is a very messy situation, trying to find reconciliation with, you know, hundreds of First Nations across the country, many of them that don't have, especially in BC, that don't have treaty. So, you know, the federal government needs to be aware of that and engaged, I think, as things heat up.
You know, I think at this point in the interview, we need to acknowledge the really stellar work that the proponents of the pipeline did in consulting with First Nations and Indigenous communities in general along the pipeline route, entering into community agreements. When the deal was announced, Energy Media came out editorially and supported it. And this, in many ways, it was a model of how to do it right, even though it may not appear that way today with the,
Right.
the Wet'suwet'en objections. But in fairness to the company and to the proponents, they actually did a good job.
Well, they had the Heisla in Kitimat area that where the LNG terminal is going to be are partnering in the program in the project. You know, they're very much in favor of it, and I assume that there are differing opinions along the pipeline, or again, there always are. But they did sign benefit agreements, and it seemed like it was going okay, except for this is not an oil pipeline, right? And there's a difference. You know, this pipeline breaks, and it's not a good thing. You can have an explosion, or we've seen that, but it doesn't leak into the ground, and it's not a tar sands pipeline where, you know, it can foul your river or your stream or your drinking water, and you have a real mess on your hands. So it's a bit different, but I'm sure the hereditary chiefs have their concerns about the impact on the land, and you know, there's a climate change element to it with, I think, a lot of the protesters who are supporting them.
Final question, Shawn. What's your take on the pulse of the temperature of Eastern Canadian voters and citizens? This obviously got their attention. We heard about propane shortages, that sort of thing. Yeah. And are they, now they were obviously annoyed while the blockade was up and those shortages and so on. They were inconvenienced. Do you think that that strategy on the behalf of the First Nations will turn the tide of public opinion in that area against First Nations, or is there a fair amount of sympathy?
I think there's still sympathy. I think that most people in Eastern Canada are not deeply engaged in this issue. You know, before we talked, I talked to my daughter who's in suburban Toronto about it. You know, and she's kind of my sounding board down there, and you know, she's way more concerned about Ontario school strikes than she is about this situation. If you're affected directly, you will be more concerned, just like if you tried to drive across a bridge and you were stopped by a protest, you're more annoyed. I do think that there are, you know, the Indigenous community as a whole has to be judicious about where they use these kinds of tactics, because I think there is a fair amount of sympathy in the country still, especially in the urban centers where there's less history, if you will. But you know, people, you know, it's like their support for unions. People like the teachers, but if you inconvenience them for too long or too deeply, you're going to lose support. And you know, hopefully the Indigenous leaders recognize that and are strategic about how they deploy the tactic.
Shawn, thank you very much. Always appreciate talking to you about energy issues, and we'll look forward to the next one.
Thanks, Markham. We'll talk to you later.